or at least identify, right? Fundamental questions, concepts rather, that we used in class, like, sort of populism. If I put in a true, false, or multiple choice question, what is populism, you should be able to identify that. Corporatism, you should be able to identify that. Agro-extractivism, what we're talking about today, you should be able to identify that, right? So if I ask you, like you'll see it on the slide today, if you have, agro-extractivism is associated with these couple of characteristics or couple of sort of consequences, you should be able to identify that, right? So, that's what I mean by that. Yeah. So, yes, there was a question. No more questions. Okay, all right. Was anybody here planning to come and see me after class today? Mark, I already talked to you. Can you talk to me after class? I actually had to modify to a personal reason. I cannot stay on campus, so. But just make sure you send me an email, and if need be, we just later today or tomorrow we can do Zoom. Okay. So same. That applies to everybody. If you need to see me, okay. What else? Of course, at this point of your educational careers, you should be able to deal with, say, multiple choice, true, false type of questions. In general, these are the easier version of things that I can, give you. Remember that as a sort of as a general rule of thumb, if part of the, if I'm asking you a true, false thing, if part of the premise, or part of the statement that I'm giving you, right, if part of it is wrong, then it's false, right? Doesn't have to be the entire thing, but if part of the statement is false, wrong, that it's incorrect, the answer to that question is going to be false, right? I mean, it's how this is done, remember just some common strategies with like a multiple choice, that if you're uncertain, try to discard the most sort of outrageous possibilities, right, in the options that you're given, and you're going to get closer to the right answer. Okay, so we were talking last session about this whole issue of food production in Mexico. It's a super important issue, as we've been discussing for several weeks now, because interestingly enough, export-oriented industrialization has involved also agriculture, as we've seen, right? We saw it with Christian Slonitsky's, I always have trouble pronouncing that last name, chapter from the book Made in Baja, that actually addressed the whole issue of agro-export zones in Mexico, how they are connected to companies in the United States. And this week, we started with Alicia Galvez's book, Eating NAFTA, which, engages this whole issue of this series of sort of paradoxes and contradictions between the elevation of Mexican food to an haute cuisine, high cuisine, while at the same time, which actually sort of commands distinction and sort of appreciation and sophistication and all of these things, and at the same time, we see how, how, certain items that are integral, that are central to the Mexican food system, or the Mesoamerican food system, I should say, become more expensive and more sort of scarce to the people of Mexico, right? And so now, as we sort of anticipated, that were discussed, as you read in these materials, Mexico's economy and agricultural industry for export is completely plugged into this North American, for sure, but also global system of exports, right, that are satisfying the appetites of consumers, particularly in the global north, right, in countries like the United States, but also Europe, Canada, etc., year-round. So, Mexico produces all of these things that you have there, right? Avocados, chiles, mangoes, limes. I actually found another very interesting video on YouTube by the same sort of Inside Business or something like that outlet on the production of limes in Mexico. It's also very interesting because it turns out that just like avocados, lime production is also so extensive, so huge, and so profitable that it becomes also a target for sort of organized crime activities, right? Especially along the lines of sort of extortion and other things. The video actually that I saw, it does not concentrate so much, or doesn't focus so much on that, but it focuses actually on the impact or the effects of climate change on lime production. But actually, in places not so far to the heartland of avocado production in Mexico, which is western Mexico, there are very large regions of lime production, and those areas are also targeted by organized crime cartels, right? Extortion of farmers and so forth and so on. We saw in the video last week how also avocado production for export is also associated with deforestation and other problems. And so so the paradox, of course, here is once again this whole thing of how these elements of the Mesoamerican food system and Mexican cuisine, if you will, is once again elevated to the level of a kind of high cuisine, right? Appreciated globally, right? But at the same time, and especially sold to consumers in the global north, along the lines of these sort of artisanal products, artisanal corn, artisanal this, artisanal that, handmade, blah, 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 et cetera, while at the same time, more and more Mexicans are, consuming or, eating mass-produced, industrially produced corn and corn, based process and fast food. Had you raised your hand back there, Mark? No. Okay. All right. So, any questions about anything that we discussed here? Anything related to Galvez, who wrote this book, Eating NAFTA? How these processes were really accelerated by Mexico's processes, economic, model change, economic paradigm, economic strategy change. By the way, large Mexican companies are very much involved in this process, right? You don't think that they're not. That it's just U.S. companies or something like that. I'm sure that when you go to the supermarket, you see, for example, tortilla chips, tortillas, all sorts of snacks produced or associated with mission foods, right? Mission foods. And Mission Foods, the actual brand of tortillas, right? Mission, is actually part of a Mexican company, a Mexican conglomerate called Gruma. And Gruma actually, has lots and lots of factories in Mexico, the United States, and most likely also other parts of the world where there's demand for Mexican food. And they produce basically cornmeal, right? And you can see the product in almost every supermarket. It doesn't have to be a sort of a Hispanic or ethnic store or something like that, right? Maseca is actually the brand that you see everywhere, right? That's produced by Gruma, and that's also sold massively in Mexico to tortilla shops, right? And Maseca, as basically sort of mass-produced cornmeal, actually is displacing the local mills that actually process, sort of grind locally produced corn dough, right, for tortillas. So I was giving you an example last class of kind of like my own experience through my team doing research in central Mexico and rural areas in central Mexico, and how people were eating beans out of cans instead of beans that they, for probably centuries, right, or who knows, millennia, had produced and been produced locally. Well, the same thing is happening with corn. A lot of these shops that used to actually process ground the corn that was locally produced, right, are actually now buying Maseca in large amounts, of course, to process it and have it ready for people who want to make tortillas, right? But it's no longer the corn that is produced locally, right, in the communities of these areas. So that's another example right there. All right. So the sort of final piece that we have today is actually a very interesting piece. We read for today an article on tequila production, right, in connection to agro-extractivism, right, in Mexico. So the story of tequila production in Mexico and tequila exports, another big export for Mexico, right, is different to the one of corn, but also, it bears some similarities with the story of avocado. All of these actually things have, connecting threads, right? A lot of these, production is geared for export. A lot of this production of foods and beverages is led by large companies, large conglomerates that end up displacing a lot of local producers, small producers, right? So the authors of this article, right, on tequila, connect this process of tequila production and the massive growth of tequila production in Mexico to this idea or this concept of agro-extractivism, right? And I think they use it more sort of purposefully than Galvez. But if so, this is actually a very important definition, right? What is agro-extractivism? Extraction of large quantities of materials, mostly for export, that are accompanied or come with environmental degradation and adverse conditions of workers, right? So I do expect you guys to be able to identify this in a question in the final exam on Tuesday here. Now, think about agro-extractivism not just in connection with food exclusively, right? You can have agro-extractivism in many other sort of forms or manifestations, right? Of course, agro-extractivism is an old story, right? In the global south, and also, why not, also the global north, right? We can think of the extraction of silver, right? A mineral in colonial times in Mexico as a form of agro-extractivism, right? A lot of these, as we read in our good old friend John Tutino, extraction of silver in Mexico during colonial times financed all sorts of things in the Spanish colonial empire, right? But this phenomenon of agro-extractivism is very much with us, right? In the examples that we already have at hand, but also in things that we actually mentioned in class not that long ago, like the soy boom, the commodity boom, and the soy production boom in South America in the early part of this century, right? Not that long ago, actually. Just, a little bit more than 10 years ago, perhaps. That actually, it's very interesting because it allowed, in some ways, the financing of a number of sort of leftist governments, right? Paradoxically, in South America, right? And it, the sort of paradoxical thing here is that it also, in some ways, deviated from sort of historic projects, historic programs of the kind of nationalist left in Latin America, right? Which was not to depend excessively on single products, right? Mono-agricultural economies, diversify the national economies, build a manufacturing base that was, more or less, capable of, satisfying domestic markets, et cetera, et cetera. But what we had in this case, in this particular case that I'm referencing here, was in fact a kind of return to economies that were reliant on one or two agro-export products, right? Commodities. The case of soy, right? In Brazil, of course, Brazil has a very diverse, huge economy, right? But certainly in the case of Argentina, for example, right? Argentina with these sort of big plains, right? The Pampas area where it's a little bit like the Midwest in the United States, right? You can just, farm huge extensions of land, and of course this was also accompanied by the demand of soy from a booming and expanding Chinese economy, right? All these industrial workers in China that producing everything that we consume here, right? Pretty much, from computers to clothing to shoes to everything had to be fed. How were they fed? How were they fed? They were fed with soy, beef coming from South America, right? And by the way, we have discussed avocados and in this case tequila and other things, right? In the case of Mexico, but actually Mexico also fits into these sort of larger trends because Mexico also exports food to Asia, for example, right? I don't know if I told you the story that I was in a Japanese supermarket some years ago, and a colleague, told me, oh, look at that. That pork actually comes from Mexico. And I sort of grabbed the tray, and in fact, the source country of pork in many Japanese supermarkets is actually Mexico, right? So now back to agro-extractivism, right? You have there some of the characteristics, right, of agro-extractivism. That's another thing I expect you to be acquainted with, to more or less keep it, at least some of these characteristics, right? Number one, materials that are extracted for export go through minimal processing and therefore are sold cheaply, right, in these sort of international markets, right? Another common characteristic of agro-extractivism is that it's actually sort of perpetrated by large companies, right? Companies that have the resources to also position these products in the international market. But this process of extraction, because there's very little processing locally, builds very little to no connections to the local economy except for labor, right? That is, there's no a chain that adds sort of value, right, to the product. It's extracted and taken out of the local context. A lot of environmental impacts or environmental degradation and deterioration of labor conditions, right? In part because companies that go into these activities have managed to create kind of sort of monopoly or monopoly conditions, right, in local labor markets. And so if you don't like the conditions that we offer you, then take your labor elsewhere, right? Which often might mean sort of migration or moving to another sector of the economy. So the authors of this article say or argue, well, if we think about agro-extractivism, as having these conditions, certainly the production of agave, which is the plant that is processed to produce tequila, and tequila itself are examples of agro-extractivism, right? We don't think when we're enjoying a margarita or a shot of tequila, we're not really thinking that much about these things. Nobody is, by and large. But then, one can imagine how the global boom in tequila consumption, right? It's also part of this sort of boom of Mexican cuisine, Mexican food elements. How those trends actually deepen, heighten these conditions, these circumstances, right? There are, of course, globally other examples, historical examples of these processes. Palm oil production. These days, a lot of it in Southeast Asia, for example, right? Indonesia, other parts of the world. And sugarcane in many parts of the world, but, in our sort of neighborhood. The U.S., actually, the Caribbean, right? Parts of Mexico and Central America, right? Are places where we have vast extensions of land dedicated to these products, often produced with, again, very serious environmental impacts. These days, including burning of sort of the refuse from these processes, right? From in sort of palm oil plantations, in sugarcane fields, et cetera, et cetera. So tequila production is concentrated in the hands of large companies. sometimes they own, but it's also very convenient to just rent land. We saw that with the example of Baja, right? Baja California production. They're not producing agave. We'll see why not. You know, agave the production of agave for tequila is highly sort of regulated, right? And it comes mostly from Western Mexico and a couple of other regions in the country that are authorized to do that, right? There's some parts of, I want to say, Oaxaca, and there's a region in northern Mexico in the state of Tamaulipas that is authorized to produce agave for tequila production. If you know, thinking about global demand, you probably could produce agave in the entire country, and global demand would not be would not be probably fully satisfied. Anyway, so most tequila is exported to the U.S., but these days also there are large, very significant quantities exported to Europe, Asia, right? And so as I was saying with the example of soy production especially in South America, you know, these are examples of how some of these Latin American economies have been reprimarized. What does that mean, reprimarized? Well, you know, kind of like back to the old economies based on or dependent on agricultural production, one or two or very few commodities, right? Primarily for export, right? This reprimarize has to do with the word primary sector, right? Primary sector is agricultural sector. Now, interestingly, once again, you know, I don't think this cannot be applied to every single Latin American economy. You know, certainly not to economies like Mexico and Brazil that are very diverse these days, right? But nonetheless, this is part of the economic reality of these countries, and it's part of the economic reality of Mexico, right? It produces a lot of money for these companies, right? So tequila is one of the most important agri-food exports to the U.S. and the world, together with the kinds of things that we talked about last class and before, right? Fruits, vegetables, and then some items that people call luxury or boutique vegetables, right? For example, all these like grape tomatoes and different, you know, kind of tomatoes that nobody eats in Mexico. It's just regular tomatoes. And but that, you know, you can see in every supermarket in the United States, for example, and that are mostly, of course, they need very special conditions of production, and they're produced mostly in like hot houses, right? In places like, you know, once again, Baja California, other parts of Mexico as well, where you can control conditions to the last detail. Yes?
Does Mexico have like exclusive contracts with, like, let's say, because tequila has to be like from tequila or like from...
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Like, let's say like champagne.
Exactly. That's the issue. That's why you cannot grow. You can grow agave anywhere you want, right? But you cannot grow agave, and you can distill that agave, but you cannot call it tequila. It has to come from that region or the regions that are authorized for it. Those two regions, in addition to Western Mexico, right? There's a region in Oaxaca, if I remember correctly, and another one in Tamaulipas. I know about the one in Tamaulipas because my dad liked the tequila that comes from Tamaulipas. Okay, TMI. There was a question back there?
Yeah, so is it like the same, you know, like what they do with like Kobe beef? You know, how like it's only supposed to come from Kobe.
Yes. The same, the example of champagne, you know, it's these, you know, I'm forgetting the exact term in English, it's like controlled denomination, right? Where you can only call it that if it comes from that particular. And of course, making sure that you control that it's a huge business, right? So I remember some years ago, not recently, but some years ago, farmers in South Africa, which has, by the way, similar environmental conditions to Western Mexico, right? In parts of South Africa, started to grow agave and started to distill it and try to call it they didn't call it tequila, but there was something like tequila. So there was a funky name like that. And immediately there were like all sorts of like lawsuits and stuff like that, right? Because from the companies that produce and control tequila distillation, yeah.
My question was more so, does Mexico have like exclusive trade agreements with those countries? Like since France can only make champagne, so do they have like a liquor agreement or like how we said Japan's beef and like other things?
Yes, the answer is
So
yes.
it is
Yeah.
a trade agreement?
Uh-huh. It's not. What happens is that I don't know exactly all the details of this stuff, but it does have the kind of control on the on how you call this product, right? That you can only legally speaking, in terms of abiding to all sorts of international agreements, etc., you can only call tequila something that comes from the tequila region in Jalisco, in those two regions that I mentioned. And if you try to call something that tastes and looks and smells like tequila, and it doesn't come from there, you'll be sued, sooner rather than later, right? So yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this is the denomination of origin, right? That's what it's called. It was established in 1974. Now it's interesting because we call tequila because it comes from this part of Mexico and this small city in the state of Jalisco in western Mexico, Tequila, Jalisco, right? But it actually, all tequilas are part of the larger family of mezcal or mezcales, right? Tequila is made of one particular, cactus, blue agave, right? Certainly produced in those parts, right? The interesting thing, of course, with tequila is that it takes a super long time to produce, right? Because for the plant to mature, right, it takes, as you can see, between 6 and 10 years. It takes, I think, a little bit longer, but it's not that different from even regular mezcal production. I have a close friend who's producing mezcal in Oaxaca, and it's you have to have not just the resources but a lot of patience, because we're talking about sort of a 10-year process essentially, right? And perhaps a little bit less. And then you have a window of a year to harvest that plant. If not, it cannot be used for the purposes of so if you're really intent on producing mezcal, or in this case tequila, you have to plant at once thousands of plants, right? Thousands of plants, and then use them, process them pretty quickly, because there's a window, and I'm sure that it's not even a year. It's actually a few months within this sort of critical year of maturity or maturation, right, of the plant. But going back to our friend tequila, there's, as I mentioned, a very substantial increase in production and demand and exportation in the context of these, free trade agreements like NAFTA. Mexico, by the way, also has free trade agreements with a bunch of other countries and in parts of the world. Mexico has a free trade agreement with the European Union. It has a free trade agreement with Japan. It has all sorts of things, in addition to being a member of the World Trade Organization, right? And one of the things that has been, there are some interesting trends, recent trends, which include the, more and more sort of big beverage companies, right? Because of the heightened demand of tequila globally, want a piece of that business, right? So have been coming into Mexico now for some time, and once again, buying land or renting land in order to produce tequila, right? There are some, and also what's happened, you guys might have heard about this, some of the old Mexican tequila brands have been purchased outright by US and European companies. The other interesting trend, it's this sort of, what these authors call this ultra premiumization, did I say it right, of tequila, right? You go to liquor stores, supermarkets, or specialty stores, right? And you see these, tequila, bottles of tequila, right? Very nice designs, et cetera, that can cost you, hundreds of dollars. And the same thing actually happens in Mexico, by the way. It's not just a reality of the US or something like that. And once again, as we discussed last class, these, fancy tequilas are sold to the consumer with this idea that these are sort of artisanal companies, right? Like micro distilleries. This is small batch production, et cetera, which brings us back to one of the very important points I think that Galvez made in IREC NAFTA, of how significant it is, how important it is to create these sort of narratives, right, around these products, right? So it's not enough to say, this has so many calories, or this tastes good, or this is nutritious on some level, but you have to create a whole story around it, right? This is, in a way, a contemporary, 21st century way of adding value and commanding a higher price for the particular item, right? This whole thing of, this comes, this made with indigenous hands and, in small batches and and from this particular valley and this particular corner of such and such valley and such place, right? Using ancestral techniques and et cetera, et cetera. It's part of that sort of narrative, right?
Would it be like on a lower basis, kind of like comparing Reposado to Cristalino? Like even within the same brand?
Comparing what?
Like Tequila Reposado versus Cristalino?
Oh, yeah. You can say that, yeah. And this is, absolutely, no doubt, yeah. This idea that this tequila has been aged. I mean, this is something that has, is applied to all sorts of, drinks, right? Has been aged so many years or that. I mean, has been done for a long time with brandy, cognac, wine, rum, etc., right? And it's interesting, right, that it's happening to tequila, right? I tell the story that I grew up in Mexico, and when growing up in Mexico, this stuff that I'm describing to you, especially this part of the presentation, this particular slide, did not exist. That was non-existent. Tequila was a inexpensive, but not just inexpensive, humble, very humble drink. In fact, disconnected with any kind of status or prestige, right? In other words, the upper middle classes, the elites of Mexico, stayed away from that stuff, right? Interesting, right? It was, a popular drink, a drink of the people, of the popular classes, right? In Mexico. There is a very interesting and kind of like parallel story. I did not really come prepared to talk about that today, but there is a very interesting parallel story with how beer you know also that Mexico is a huge beer producer, right, these days. So beer in Mexico actually, you know, when you think about, you know, what do Mexicans drink in or prefer in terms of, say, alcoholic beverages, you know, of course it's beer, right? I mean, it has also lower, you know, alcohol content, and but beer fought its own battle, and beer producers waged its own battle against traditional, really artisanal drinks earlier in the 20th century. What other beverage or drink did beer displace in Mexico? Does anybody know? Anybody knows? This is where I'm testing your connoisseurship about alcoholic beverages. Won't be included in the exam, but I do want to ask you, what did beer displace in Mexico as a kind of like a high class or respectable? That would be a better word, like kind of like something that respectable people, you know, urbane, respectable people drink. Yes? No. Mexico has great conditions for production of wine in certain regions, but remember that the Spanish crown did not want, and did everything possible to prevent the production of wine in Mexico, because it was competition to the wine that was produced in the peninsula, right, in Spain. So it, you know, levied all sorts of taxes. It was like, it really, you know, and that's the reason why not until recently Mexico doesn't have decent wine. Decent and expensive, right? And inexpensive, I mean. But what's the drink?
I was thinking like second place would be like alcohol de carne, like straight.
Maybe for certain parts of Mexico, but in general, it's not sugarcane-based alcohol or alcohol de caña. It's anybody want you know?
Wait, is it another drink?
It's another drink, of course. Yeah, it's another drink. Very, very popular, inexpensive, really rooted in Mesoamerican culture, right? No. Rompope is made. It's a very sort of Spanish drink. No, not mezcal. Not rum. No. Which one? No. Vodka is Eastern European. It's a fermented beverage. Pulque. Who said pulque? Eso. My man, pulque. Yes. How is pulque made? Where does it come from? It's no. That's a different thing. No, it's not pineapple. Can you Google it? How is pulque made?
I'll do it.
Fermented sap of a plant.
Yes.
Colored milk.
How do you spell it? Is it
P-U-L-Q.
Pulque.
Okay.
It's made also from cactus, but it's fermented as opposed to distilled. So it produces these. What's the word that I'm looking for? My English is limited, as you know. This sappy type of consistency in the drink. And so anyway, pulque, inexpensive, made in small batches because it really doesn't lend itself to industrial production, right? Small batches, you need to consume it soon, relatively soon after production. You cannot store it for like long periods of time. Was the popular drink of the masses in Mexico, right, for centuries. And And so in the early, especially starting in the 20th century, Mexico starts, late 19th century, early 20th century, Mexico starts to bring these German brewmasters to produce beer and to build breweries, right? I'm from Monterrey, Mexico, in northern Mexico, an industrial city that has this huge brewery, right? Built in the late 1800s. And, you know, the companies that, you know, built this brewery without the local expertise, what did they do? They brought German brewmasters, right? And including the builders who built these, you know, breweries. Not only the people who knew how to brew beer. And so, but anyway, the punchline to my story here is that these companies needed to market their product to a population that was used to drink pulque and other things too, right? I mean, yeah, of course, you know, sugarcane alcohol probably in the coastal areas or areas where, you know, sugarcane is produced. And so the story that I'm trying to tell here is that they started advertising beer as the drink of it's kind of like civilized, you know, European-looking, aspiring, urbane Mexicans, right? Pulque was the drink of the indigenous people of Mexico. And you didn't really want to be associated with that if you were a sort of contemporary, modern, aspiring Mexican, right? You wanted to drink beer, right? You know, all these companies also pitch these sort of you know, other things like nutritional values and those kinds of things. I'm less interested in that, and more in the kind of sort of, you know, symbolism and images associated with this drink, right? And so it happens with tequila, right? Tequila also, you know, has all these sort of narratives, right, and stories built around the consumption of tequila, right? And these days, you open, you know, of course, you go online, you watch a movie, you open a magazine, if those still exist, and you'll find, you know, for example, how these, you know, Hollywood celebrities are, you know, flocking to Mexico to produce their own tequila brands, right? And then we get all the stories, you know, all the narratives, you know, associated with these artisanal, you know. But there are other things, right, that are connected to having, you know, George Clooney and Eva Longoria and The Rock and so on, connected or associated with these particular brands, the consumption of tequila, and so forth and so on, right? Now, just like the celebrities, right, just like the aristocracy of Hollywood, you know, we can also, you know, so be a step closer to them if we drink what they drink, right? That's been, this is an old, you know, marketing strategy anyway. So think about that the next time you drink Amigos tequila. Anyway, just to hammer on some of these points, you know, global demand increasing exponentially, which requires us, because of what the conditions that you need to produce tequila, that you increase the acreage, right, for agave cultivation, right? This, you know, huge territorial expansion goes hand in hand with either buying out small farmers or turning them into, you know, basically sharecroppers, right? Because they are going to keep property of their land, but they're going to be subject to the conditions imposed by the big companies that are renting their land, right? In terms of how many plants, when to harvest them, under what conditions, exclusive agreements for selling the plant to these companies, and et cetera, right? So, of course, agave production, just like many other things that we've discussed here, are not part of the certainly in this style of production, they're not part of the traditional or historic milpa system, right? Which is associated with more or less sort of sustainable ways of production, producing food for human consumption, of course, for self-consumption often, under conditions of mass agro-extractivist production. What you have is a displacement of traditional crops, small farmers, getting subordinated to these big companies, to the extent that it's one plant, one crop that comes to dominate, you lose genetic diversity. This is accompanied by the extensive use of agrochemicals, because the ultimate and final and only goal of this is to have that plant, right? Grow, survive, and be ready in 6, 7, 8 years for harvesting, right? And other things that you have there, right? We also see, or the authors tell us, right, that there are very serious environmental conditions, consequences, in part because the, I'm sure you've seen videos of how, tequila is produced, how the agave plant is processed. There's a lot of refuse that is left, right? And not only that, but also the process of distillation leaves a type of alcohol that is not for human consumption because it's toxic. And the question is, what do you do with that, right? Where do you pour it? Where you drop it? How do you deal with that, right? And a lot of it ends up in waterways, in Mexico, rivers and things like that, and with all sorts of polluting effects. The authors kind of say, well, we have to look at mezcal as a kind of alternative, or but I'm not so convinced of that, because mezcal might be going, or maybe it's already going the same way as tequila, in the sense that to the extent that there is a boom in demand, global demand for mezcal, people are going crazy about this other, also very humble drink. There are, also these similar processes, going on. Perhaps the authors don't go into detail onto sort of how mezcal could be a different way of dealing, with these issues. But the one saving grace that I can think of mezcal is that mezcal is produced in Oaxaca, in the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. It's a heavily indigenous state with a lot of communal lands, and communities in Oaxaca have a long history of resistance against these sort of destructive impulses of global capitalism, right? And so, but again, I'm not necessarily like super hopeful and mezcal might be the next tequila, or maybe already is the next tequila, not just in terms of popularity globally, et cetera, but also in terms of many of its negative consequences, right, in terms of production. Questions about any of this stuff? I'm listening. Any questions? Yes?
I was reading chapter 24 of USMCA, and that's like the environmental provisions.
Yes.
And it doesn't mention anything about kind of how about like the opposite along those lines of like having to pay like a tax or extra for environmental like exploitation. So I was wondering, now that the USMCA has included like technical mathematic calculation for wages, do you think the next move, or like the next move would be applying that to environmental regulations?
That's a great question. Could, I can only speculate, right? Could be. There will be a revision or a review of the trade agreement soon, and this might be the next frontier, right? Expanding the labor protection provisions, that's one thing, but also trying to have environmental regulations much more connected to the trade agreement. And the issue is always, does it have teeth or not, right? In other words, can you establish provisions that are enforceable and that have sort of consequences if somebody violates, right? Say the environmental regulations. What kinds of penalties, what kinds of sort of bodies that adjudicate, that make decisions, right? Tribunals or courts or something like that, right? Panels that determine whether, yes, it happened, didn't happen. How effective, what kinds of resources those bodies have. Those are the kinds of details that really matter, right? Because in the original NAFTA, 1994, right? The three governments, but mostly Mexico and the United States, did everything they could to keep labor, certainly migration, and the environmental issues outside of the main trade agreement, right? In the most recent version of the sort of NAFTA 2.0, right? The USMCA, there was some progress in terms of making the auto industry and labor work within the labor industry part of the agreement, particularly establishing some baseline wages for auto workers, right? That has to do with the power of unions in the United States, and unions in the auto industry, right? So
probably not, because all Americans own everything in Mexico now.
Well, more than anything, we wanna think about how strong, the environmental movement is. How, if we stay with the example of the environment, right, which was your original question, how attentive the government in Washington, depending on which political party, all of that stuff, right? How much do they sort of care, and how much do they depend, for example, on, or how much leverage do environmental organizations, NGOs, so on, have on that particular government at the time of the negotiation, right, or renegotiation of the agreement. So, yeah, I'm not like super hopeful, but it is, it is something that is coming up, actually. Yes, I don't remember exactly, but I think the new government in Mexico, the Sheinbaum government, will have to deal with that. That's one of the things that I've been reading in the Mexican media, Yeah, so in the newspapers now, in relation to the kinds of sort of challenges that the new government in Mexico will face in that kind of international arena. So I lost the page that I had here, but yeah. So pulque, if you care to know, this is not an invitation to drink an alcoholic beverage. I'm not sponsored by the pulque industry, by the way. The way things are going in universities, we will probably at some point, right? I'll post my lectures in the future and I say, this lecture is brought to you by Tequila Amigos. I'm a friend of George Clooney. Not. So pulque is also made from agave, right? But it's a process, if I remember correctly, of fermentation as opposed to distillation, right? So, and that's why instead of these sort of crystalline liquid, right? That is processed, that is produced through distillation. You have this sort of sappy consistency in the drink. And you can add, I'm not saying to try this at home, but you can add like flavors, right? If you add fruits and other things. So, yeah, it's good. So beer displays pulque. That was the story, right? So already 20s, 30s, 40s in Mexico. If you look at ads for beer, it's super interesting in newspapers, right? Which were one of the, of course, radio, right? Film at some point, television later on. The thing was, drink beer because the pulque is kind of like the drink of the uncivilized masses, right? Rural uncivilized masses. Urban, sophisticated Mexicans drink beer, and this is our brand, blah blah blah, right? So this is actually very interesting, and there's sort of a similarity to the story of how you pitch tequila, right? I saw a hand, yeah.
So just out of curiosity, what's like the cream of the crop when it comes to Mexican tequilas?
Am I supposed to know that or what? I have no idea. I can recommend that outside of class. I can recommend a few brands, but yeah, we're not at that point when I interrupt my lecture to say this lecture is brought to you by. Yes.
You mentioned that NAFTA increased the export of these commodities, and I was just wondering if there's other impacts it had on these agro-export zones, and maybe how exactly.
So one of the things is that because it's a free trade agreement, you lower the tariffs, right, on these products. So without going into the specifics of it, these, tequila has and other products, made in Mexico have lower tariffs, lower taxes, going into when they're exported to the U.S., right? But the same, remember, that's what we said about U.S. corn going into Mexico, right? So yeah, and imposing or increasing tariffs, it's considered a violation of the rules of the agreement, right? Especially when that is clearly specified. You cannot, all of these things are, listed in those agreements, right? All these products, all these, rules, et cetera, right? So, absolutely. So it's clearly spelled out. So this is one of the things. The other thing in which this happens is precisely as our previous slide showed, although these are kind of more the sort of artisanal type of things. But, think about, the U.S., large conglomerates, right? The same company that owns Budweiser, right? They also, I think I'm not entirely sure. My memory fails right now, but I think it's the same. That same company also has gone and purchased all sorts of tequila brands in Mexico, right? And so the flow of capital, right? This is another thing that free trade agreements facilitate, right? You don't, remember that under ISI, when a foreign company invested in Mexico, it had to find a local partner, and it could not own majority of shares in the company. That's gone under EOI, right? Now there is a kind of deregulated foreign direct investment. You go and buy whatever you want, right? And so that's another way in which this sort of happens, right? These companies, by the way, in addition to have a lot of, it all boils down to the sort of the resources that they have. But to be more specific, maybe some folks here are studying marketing and those kinds of things, or international trade and so on. What is critical for some of these things is not just production capacity or capital to go and buy, I don't know how many hectares of land to set up a distillery or whatever. What really matters is distribution channels, right? Because you can produce all the tequila in the world, but if you don't have the shelf space, if you don't control shelf space in supermarkets, liquor stores, all these different places, right, where this is produced, then you're nothing, right? So this is what these companies also have, right? A lot of control, a lot of power to impact and control distribution channels. So absolutely, yeah. And there was a question here.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious if you know if the tequila production is impacted by the cartel as well as avocado farming. I'm just wondering like why, if it's across the board that's an issue, or if it's like avocados specifically are vulnerable to it.
That's a great question. I haven't heard too many stories about tequila, and maybe the fact that it's large U.S. and European conglomerates are controlling the business, maybe that makes them less vulnerable than compared to local farmers, local producers. But what you hear in terms mostly is avocado, lime, and other commodities. Yes.
Also last year I went to Tequila and like you know how come you can tour the distilleries and everything, and from what it seems, there's a high level of security
Yes.
in those plants, so I think that might also contribute to why they're not able to, or the cartels aren't as able to get a hold of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions, comments? So, don't go anywhere. I'll still have you for a couple of minutes. One ask on my part: if you have time, please, and the inclination to do so, because it's not mandatory, please complete the evaluation of this course. It's been an honor and a pleasure to teach this course to you guys, and it's been fun. It's always fun to teach this course, although it's only the second time I taught this course. It's relatively new, so I'll see you on Tuesday here. Okay? Thank you.